Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the paranormal yakker. My guest in today's show is Peter Robbins. For more than 40 years, he has been actively involved in UFO studies as a researcher, investigator, writer, public speaker, activist, and author. Peter Robbins, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Thank you, Stan. I'm glad to be here with you.
You, Peter, have lectured on and written about numerous topics related to the UFO phenomena, a phenomena that is worldwide in scope. And I will for sure be asking you questions about some of them. However, before doing that, I was curious to know what initially sparked your interest in UFOs.
Important question. I will say I had no interest in the subject as a child. It was only in my late 20s that a repressed memory from childhood came roaring back for reasons I think I now understand, involving a profoundly unambiguous daylight sighting of 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects over our home on Long Island, New York, that I observed with my sister. I was simply unable to deal with it. I intuitively understood the ridicule factor involved. It made me more uncomfortable than I can say. And as a result, I did what sometimes people do. For me, this was traumatic. I repressed that memory. When it came back with a vengeance. And after kind of calming down and wondering how people can repress memories that are so impacting, but we know it's a human phenomena, I telephoned my sister, very careful not to tell her what I had remembered, but saying instead, I want to set the scene here and see. And she cut me off mid-sentence as I was starting to describe the time of day, where we were standing, how old we were, and then basically told me everything I remembered, which was both exhilarating and anxiety provoking, and then said there's more. At a time before, really, there was a formal area in UFO studies about the abduction phenomena. She shared with me memories that she had never forgotten about being taken, being on board. Now they're so archetypical. I've spoken with, I'm sure, several hundred people over the years minimum who have almost identical memories, even to the things that they were hearing in their head. But at the time, it was the most shattering thing I had ever heard in my life. I became obsessed with the subject. My career path, which was something I was very dedicated to, being a New York City-based painter, ultimately kind of was pushed aside. And here I am all these years later, still doing this work.
Bud Hopkins was an accomplished artist, author, and ufologist. He was also a prominent figure in alien abduction phenomena and the related UFO research. You, Peter, had a 35-year-long friendship and work relationship with him. When did you first meet, and to what do you attribute the success of that relationship?
We first met less than a year after I became involved in this subject. He had just investigated his very first case and published it in a New York City weekly newspaper, The Village Voice. I walked by a newsstand that week. I literally did a double take, Stan. It was a headline that said, quote unquote, "Sane man sees UFO." Well, of course, I bought it and took it home. I was really impressed by how thorough his research was, how non-mystical, how pragmatic, the fact that he was a very good writer. It went on to become, as I recall, MUFON's case of the year for that year, 1976 or 7. But I went to the New York City phone book. I found there's one Bud Hopkins in the book, spelled his first name with 2 Ds. The New York City art world is rather small and incestuous, and I knew there was a painter by that name. I think I had seen one of his works in a group show some years before, and I wondered if it was the same person. And I cold called him and introduced myself as a fellow painter on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts who had become very involved in this work and had a childhood sighting that my sister seemed to have had an experience. Bud's very first question to me on the phone was, "Tell me about your artwork." That didn't really go too well. He was a late period abstract expressionist. I was coming out of minimalist conceptual art kind of background, but he was very intrigued by my sister's case, and he invited me over for coffee. A few days later, I showed up at his home. We sat in his kitchen and talked about art life and UFOs, but I had no idea what was coming. This was 5 years before he published his first real paradigm-shifting book on the abduction phenomena called Missing Time. And at that point, his career became a dual career as a painter and as a more or less full-time UFO abduction researcher. He started to need help, and I began to assist him. In '87, his second book, Intruders, became an international bestseller. From then until about 2000, I was full-time, part-time assistant to him, and he really was the father of the scientific investigation of UFOs as a field. A remarkable man who we lost 11 years ago to cancer, somebody who was one of the finest people and best artists and greatest guys that I ever knew.
James Forrestal was the last cabinet-level United States Secretary of the Navy and the first United States Secretary of Defense. He also managed a UFO project for the Truman administration in the late 1940s. You, Peter, believe he was an early casualty of UFO secrecy. Why do you believe that?
James Forrestal first came to my attention more than 30 years ago. I wondered in learning about him why I had never heard about him before. From really through 1940 through his death in 1949, he was one of the most important people in the Roosevelt and Truman administration as Secretary of Navy, and he helped us markedly with our World War II efforts. He created, at the request of President Truman, our modern Department of Defense, and then went on, as you note, to become its first Secretary of Defense. One can only imagine how he must have felt on his very first day in that post in later September of 1947, a scant 2.5 months after Roswell and the Kenneth Arnold sightings that kicked off our modern age of UFOs. And as Secretary of Defense, he was privy to everything that we were coming to know about this phenomena. While seemingly something of a tough guy and an alpha male on the outside, he was actually very scholarly and quite sensitive. My studies, which have gone on and off for 30 years, show me, beyond what I consider any reasonable doubt, that he cracked under the pressure. He was, I think, crushed by the fact that in his tenure as Secretary of Defense, he was unable to do anything to get to the bottom of this mystery, to present President Truman with reasonable facts surrounding it, anything to contribute to the defense, should they be hostile, and had a profound nervous breakdown. At that point, this is 1949, nobody knew anybody who was in therapy, and least of all an alpha male in Truman's circle. He became, I'm convinced, in the perception of that group of advisors closest to Harry Truman, potentially the greatest security risk in the history of the Western world. What happens if he got well and then had a relapse? He could say anything. I think Forrestal knew this and attempted to take his life several times within those few awful days, was then institutionalized at Bethesda Naval Hospital, ultimately responded well to treatment and regained his will to live, but they couldn't let him live. Ultimately, for me, I thought, this is a very important American story. This man was a true patriot, truly an early casualty of what I would call the UFO cover-up. So I wrote about it. I studied. Things became available as they were declassified over the years. And ultimately, I made a small documentary called The Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death of James Forrestal. It is not online, but you can get copies from a website called On Wings, ONWINGES.com. It's a full-hour documentary, fully illustrated. I think, from the reactions I've gotten, it is very convincing.
Russia's best-known close encounter of the third kind, which you have written about, was the Voronezh incident that took place in 1989. Could you, Peter, elaborate on that incident?
Yeah, a fascinating case, Stan. This is the best-known UFO incident in the history of the Soviet Union, and it happened as the Soviet Union was literally disintegrating. Any student of post-war history knows that 1989, 1990 is when it all happened under President Gorbachev. Voronezh is a city about 300 miles southwest of Moscow, and on that particular afternoon in September '89, a fully articulated disc-shaped UFO came down into a public park and came down in a tree. One of the things that made the case so sensational and so easy for the media to poke fun at was it didn't fit the parameters of a lot of other cases. And so you can single it out, say, well, that's nonsense because we never heard of that scenario before. But two beings, one extremely tall, the other robot-like, made their way out of the craft down the tree and began to move around the park. Hundreds of people witnessed it, including many school children. Testimony was taken. Truly anomalous things happened to the organic material, the tree, the soil under it, where it was in contact with them or with the craft. And the American newspapers overall seemed to have kind of a schizophrenic relationship with it. They took it seriously and then didn't take it seriously. Same for the broadcast media. But I was fortunate enough to link up with a scientist in the Soviet Union who lived in Voronezh, who was a UFO investigator, and he and his team were right there by the end of that day investigating, and ended up writing a book, only available in Russian, unfortunately, but we corresponded for several years. Based on that, I wrote a series of articles, conference papers, and the like. It's a very important case. It's never gotten the proper attention that fully deserves in American ufology, I think.
Wilhelm Reich was a doctor of medicine and a psychoanalyst. He wrote several influential books and was considered a radical figure in psychiatry. At one point, he became interested in UFOs and arrived at certain conclusions concerning them. Can you expand on Dr. Reich's connection to the UFO phenomena?
We could literally spend hours, if not days, talking about just this. Dr. Reich was a millennial genius as far as I'm concerned. I was first introduced to his writings when I was still a teenager, ultimately went into therapy for some years with his former first assistant of many years. Many people who see him as loopy or delusional. Most people have never read a word of any of the more than 20 books or so that have been published. He, in the later part of his life, he became extremely interested in the UFO phenomena, not really giving it much thought beforehand. His science was all about how energy functions in the living and non-living realms. He observed them and had created a device, deceptively simple, for moving energy in the atmosphere. He called it Cloudbuster. I became very familiar with the principles, but it was some years until I actually saw one in operation. And it was a life-changing day. I saw the operator say, I'm going to transform that cloud bank over there. I'm going to vaporize that cloud. I'm going to cut that cloud in half. This was purely a demonstration. Properly used, this technology can break droughts, and it's tragedy that it's not taken seriously. But his ultimate observations about UFOs were borne out by many observers working with him, all of them keeping their very careful notes and scientific measurements. Through the Cloudbuster, when pointed at them, they seemed to respond in a negative way and move. These experiments were repeated. It's all very well laid out in his final book called Contact with Space. He died in November of 1957. The book was published posthumously in the following month. Unfortunately, only 500 copies were ever printed. If you have a copy, you have a very valuable book. However, the bookstore at the Wilhelm Reich Museum in Rangeley, Maine, sells a very good first-generation photocopy. And if you're seriously interested in the subject, I would suggest you get a copy. But it's probably not the best first book of his to read. Again, I don't use the word lightly. He was a genius. And his studies of how energy functions, for me, are the basis of, well, if we don't blow ourselves to hell as we move into the future, of a way of seeing science and the natural world that clarifies a lot of questions, not to mention human behavior itself.
For a number of years, you served as a consultant to the city of Roswell and was their liaison to Governor Richardson's office on UFO-related matters. What was the interaction like between you and the governor regarding the alleged 1947 crash of a UFO in Roswell?
I have to say that was one of the most interesting jobs I ever had. A lot of it revolved around 2 or 3 years of working out of the mayor's office at a distance. I live in New York State, helping to put together their annual UFO conference and very popular UFO festival. Governor Richardson took the subject very seriously until he declared his intention to run for president, this is about 10 years plus ago, the media turned it into a circus and hounded the hell out of him and put him in a position where he basically had to back off to some degree and backpedal and say he didn't take it that seriously. Our interactions were never direct. It was always through his secretary, and it was more or less relaying questions from the mayor or the museum or some area within the city governance regarding the subject. I remember about the time, I think it was the last Indiana Jones movie came out with a Roswell related theme. The governor, a lot of people in Roswell and in New Mexico were very excited about this. It was bringing attention to the subject and to the city in a very popular series of films. Again, this is not hard politics or about disclosure, but the governor very much wanted the production company to have an old-fashioned Hollywood type opening, either in the Capitol or in Roswell. And it was one of those times where they decided to open it at a number of locations at the same time. So there was no opportunity to get together with all the actors, which I know disappointed him to a great degree, and me too.
In the early days of the UFO cover-up, much of the media colluded with the U.S. government in denying the existence of UFOs and ridiculing those who said they existed. This included the New York Times. How did this alliance between the media and the government come about?
This is a subject also, like Forrestal and a number of other projects I become involved in, that evolved for me over the years. For me, I started by, in the old days before the Times articles were all digitized, spending time in their newspaper morgue in New York City, where I would locate an article. I would make the notes on the code number, bring it to the microfiche editor. She would give me the microfiche, and like the old high school days, put it in the machine, put in your quarter or whatever, print out the article. I came back to the project once everything was digitized and ultimately had about 220 articles, letters to the editor, editorials, put them in order and read them and reread them and reread them, looking for a pattern. And it was very clear, whether it was a huge front page piece or, something tucked away on page 18, it was all about ridicule, condescension, dismissiveness, making fun of it in very short order in the summer of 1947, influencing a lot of the rest of the media. And most of the media at that point was print media. Radio was certainly coming into its own. Television didn't exist yet. And by the end of the summer of 47, the American public, and by extension the Western world, understood that little green men, flying saucers, you want to take this subject seriously, we're going to make fun of you. And that's how it was for 70 years. It only started to change about 5 years ago. So what I ended up doing was, once again, writing a number of papers about it. And this year, it kind of all came to a head with giving versions of these research papers in England in May, Denver last month at the International MUFON Symposium, and coming up in a few weeks, the final version will be delivered by me at a wonderful event. If you're in the Northeast, maybe you can attend it. It's the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Conference and Festival. I'll be joined by a number of distinguished speakers. It's really about the origin of UFO ridicule, how the venerable New York Times kind of led the charge. But with some irony, they were the ones who published the first two articles in December of 2017 that began to turn things around again. So history is a funny way of making good on itself sometimes.
In your extensive research and investigation of the UFO abduction phenomenon, did you find any commonalities amongst the abductees, such as the circumstances in which they were abducted and their interactions with the alien beings who abducted them?
The core of the key researchers who really pioneered this, and I'm, simply somebody who was along for the ride in great part and had the great privilege of assisting the best and the most knowledgeable of them, the answer is an overwhelming yes. The patterns are extraordinarily similar worldwide. The individuals involved come from every kind of socioeconomic, racial, religious kind of background or lack of religious background. One premise that we had put forward when the research started was completely turned on its head as the data started to accumulate. Namely, the original idea was, if something like this happens to you, it's probably as rare as getting hit by lightning. And certainly it's a random thing like, oh, there's one, let's grab them, and that it wouldn't repeat. In fact, and it's a rather chilling reality, it is something that they whatever group of them involved with that aspect of UFOs, namely advanced machines from parts unknown under intelligent control. There are other explanations as well, but they follow family bloodlines. I've spoken to 3 generations in certain families who have almost identical histories. And people sometimes say, well, where's the evidence? Well, there's a lot of physical evidence, and some of it is on the bodies of the individuals involved. You go to sleep one night, you wake up feeling disoriented with strange dreams, and you find like a scoop mark where tissue has been taken, but it's already cauterized. It's not bleeding. It's already resettled. And I've even seen that same mark on the leg of a well-known abductee, and in the same place from years before on her mother's leg. But the things that these experiencers are told, always telepathically, even the words are identical or very similar and always in their own language. It is, I think, the most complex, disturbing, important, ultimately central issue, that part of the UFO phenomenon. And what is going on is some kind of program. The euphemism that we used to use is they're experimenting. They're not experimenting. They're following bloodlines for their own reasons, and what it's all leading to, we can only make our best educated guesses, Stan.
In your writings and lectures, Peter, you have covered UFO and alien imagery in advertising and have asked the question if it has been used as an innocent sales device or is it calculated social engineering. Can you share your findings on that?
Well, you should do your homework. My background is in the arts. I had trained to be a painter. I taught painting in New York City for many years. I studied book illustration. I made part of my living commercially. I became more and more interested in how ubiquitous UFOs and aliens are in advertising. Was it, in fact, because people are going through, usually in the old print days, a magazine or a newspaper, and they see an ad with the flying saucer and they stop, either to make fun of it or because they're interested in the subject? Was this all random because Madison Avenue, for lack of a better term, they study this stuff too, and they know if they can stop people and usually have a little fun with the subject, maybe they can sell a product? Or was there some kind of, or is there some kind of gentle program in play as part of long-range disclosure to help normalize the subject or keep it in the public eye, almost always with a bit of humor involved? And after a great deal of research, writing papers, giving talks, I realized I don't know the answer to the question. I think overwhelmingly, there's not a lot behind it. Almost every advertisement that I've seen and analyzed, the one given thing is that, yes, UFOs are real in selling insurance and hardware, computer services, and this and that, but there's nothing behind it. And at the same time, 1 or 2 cases were very intriguing. One involving the corporate head of the Levi Strauss Company, who was a board member of a think tank that had government connections, etc. As the late, great ufologist Stanton T. Friedman used to say, that's in my gray box. It could go either way, and maybe both things are true.
You, Peter, are associate producer of the award-winning documentary Travis, the True Story of Travis Walton, and writer, director, and producer of the documentary The Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death of James Forrestal, which you spoke about earlier in the interview. Are other documentaries on the drawing board that you'd like to share?
Not really. These were both kind of one-offs for me. By chance, the producer, executive producer and director, and cameraman and tech guy for the very accomplished Travis Walton documentary, which you can also find at onwings.com or onwingsproductions.com, and that's WINGES. I had introduced Jennifer Stein to Travis about 10 years ago, and she and her cameraman, Bob Terrio, worked with him for 5 years, and all of the witnesses and all of the other people involved returning to Arizona to produce one of the finest documentary case studies in the history of UFO-related documentaries. Both of them will actually, by chance, be guests on my radio show, this coming Monday. My show is called Meanwhile Here on Earth. It broadcasts every week on KGRA Digital Broadcasting, and it will be a 2-hour in-depth interview with these two very fine filmmakers.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to contact you and learn about the various events and projects you are and will be involved with, what is your contact information?
I post everything on my main social network venue, which is Facebook, also on Twitter, where I am at Peter Robbins UFO. And anybody that wants to can, again, contact me at my Facebook page or send me an email at probbinsny@yahoo.com.
Peter Robbins, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. Yakking with you has been most informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.